The champagne glass shattered against the hardwood floor, sending crystal shards across my childhood living room like frozen tears. 20 years of my life's work, gone in an instant. The manuscript pages scattered among the debris, some soaking up the expensive Dom Perignon that my parents had been celebrating with just moments before. "Oh, sorry. It was just an accident," my mother said, her lips curling into that familiar smirk I'd grown to despise. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. My father stood beside her, his own expression a mirror of her false innocence, though his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. I stared at the wreckage of my novel, the one I'd spent 2 decades perfecting. The one that had finally been accepted by a major publishing house after countless rejections. The only copy that contained my handwritten notes, my precious edits, my soul poured onto paper. The backup files existed, of course, but this manuscript held something irreplaceable. My journey, my growth, my metamorphosis from a dreamy teenager to a serious writer. "You know," my father added casually, adjusting his expensive watch, "maybe this is a sign. Maybe it's time you got a real job instead of chasing these childish fantasies." The family party continued around us, cousins laughing in the kitchen, aunts gossiping on the porch, uncles watching the game in the den. None of them had witnessed what just happened. None of them would believe it if I told them. My parents, the successful real estate moguls, the pillars of the community, the perfect couple who'd raised their only child with such dedication and love. At least, that's how the story went. But I knew better. I'd always known better. This wasn't an accident. Nothing with my parents ever was. 24 hours earlier, I had walked into this same living room with hope in my heart and my manuscript tucked carefully under my arm. The publishing contract was signed, the advance deposited, and my debut novel was scheduled for release in 8 months. I'd finally done it. I'd proven that my dream wasn't just a childish fantasy. "Mom, Dad, I have something incredible to share," I'd announced, practically vibrating with excitement. They'd looked up from their respective devices, Mom from her tablet where she managed their property portfolio, Dad from his phone where he tracked their investments. For a moment, I'd seen something flicker across their faces. Not pride, as I'd hoped, but something darker. "Let me guess," my father had said, setting down his phone with deliberate slowness. "Another rejection letter? Don't worry, sweetheart, we've prepared for this. Johnson and Associates has an entry-level position that would be perfect for someone with your creative background." "No, Dad. I sold it, my novel, to Hartwell Publishing. They want me." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's perfectly manicured fingers had tightened around her tablet until her knuckles went white. My father's jaw had clenched in that way that meant he was calculating, planning. "How much?" he'd asked finally. "The advance is 50,000, but if it does well—" 50,000. My mother had laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Darling, we make more than that in a single property flip. This isn't success. This is a hobby that finally broke even." But I'd seen through their dismissal. I'd seen the fear in their eyes, the panic that their carefully controlled child was finally breaking free. For 20 years, they'd systematically undermined my confidence, sabotaged my opportunities, and manipulated me into believing I needed them. They'd convinced me that my writing was worthless, that I was naive, that the world would chew me up and spit me out without their protection. And now, with a publishing contract in hand, I was proving them wrong. That's when I'd announced the family party, a celebration that I thought would force them to acknowledge my success publicly. In front of aunts and uncles and cousins, surely they couldn't maintain their facade of disappointment. How naive I'd been. Now, staring at my destroyed manuscript, I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. It wasn't grief. Not anymore. It was clarity. "You're right," I said quietly, my voice carrying across the suddenly still room. It was an accident. My parents exchanged a quick glance, surprised by my calm acceptance. "I'm glad you understand, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Sometimes these things happen for a reason. Maybe now you can focus on something more practical." I nodded, bending down to gather the soggy pages. "You know what else is an accident? That leak in your rental property on Maple Street?" My father frowned. "What leak?" "Oh, you haven't noticed yet?" I stood, clutching the ruined papers to my chest. "I called the city inspector yesterday. Apparently, there's a significant water leak that's been causing mold growth in the walls. Quite dangerous for tenants, according to the housing authority. They'll be issuing a notice tomorrow." The color drained from my mother's face. "That's impossible. We just had that property inspected last month." "6 months ago," I corrected. "I checked. And according to the tenant I spoke with, lovely woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, the leak started 3 months ago. She's been calling your property management company, but somehow those calls never made it to you." This was a lie, of course, but I'd learned from masters of deception. "You're bluffing," my father said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo, the business card of a city inspector, along with a timestamp from that morning. Mr. Peterson was very interested in hearing about neglected rental properties. Apparently, there's been an uptick in slumlord prosecutions lately. My parents stared at the phone, then at each other, then back at me. For the first time in my adult life, I saw uncertainty in their eyes. "But don't worry," I continued, my voice still maddeningly calm. "I'm sure it's just an accident that you haven't been maintaining your properties properly. Just like it was an accident that you destroyed the manuscript for my published novel in front of 20 family members." The next few days unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of consequence. The city inspector's visit to the Maple Street property revealed not just the fictional leak I'd reported, but several actual code violations that my parents had been ignoring. Word spread quickly through their business network. Real estate was all about reputation, and neglected properties were a red flag to both tenants and investors. But that was just the overture. I'd spent 20 years watching my parents operate, learning their methods, understanding their weaknesses. They'd taught me how to manipulate, how to plan, how to strike when your target was most vulnerable. They just hadn't expected me to use those lessons against them. The second movement began when I contacted their largest investor, Mr. Chen, with concerns about their business practices. Not accusations, just worried questions from a devoted daughter who'd overheard some troubling conversations. Was it normal for property management companies to ignore tenant complaints? Should I be worried about liability issues? I just wanted to make sure my parents weren't taking on too much risk. Mr. Chen began asking questions. The third movement started when several of their tenants received anonymous tips about their rights under local housing laws. Amazing how many violations people discover when they know what to look for. The tenant on Oak Street found out she'd been overcharged for utilities. The family on Pine Avenue learned that their security deposit had been illegally withheld. Mrs. Patterson on Elm Street discovered that the necessary repairs that had justified her rent increase were actually cosmetic improvements that didn't qualify under state law. 3 lawsuits were filed within a week. By the end of the month, my parents' carefully constructed empire was crumbling. Their reputation in tatters, their investor backing withdrawn, their liquid assets frozen pending litigation. They'd built their success on cutting corners and exploiting people who didn't know better, a strategy that worked beautifully until someone turned a spotlight on their methods. I watched it all unfold from my apartment across town, where I was working on my second novel. The publisher loved my first book and wanted to fast-track the sequel. Turns out, having a published author as a daughter might have been an asset my parents never bothered to consider. The phone call started on a Tuesday. "Sweetheart, we need to talk." My mother's voice had lost all its superiority, replaced by something I'd never heard before. Desperation. "Of course, Mom. Is everything okay? You know everything's not okay. We know what you've been doing." I feigned confusion. "What do you mean? The inspector? The tenants? The lawsuits? This is all you, isn't it?" "Mom, I'm just a writer. What would I know about real estate law or city inspections?" The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. "We're losing everything," she whispered finally. "I'm sorry to hear that. It sounds like it might have been building up for a while. Sometimes these things happen for a reason. Maybe now you can focus on something more honest." I hung up before she could respond. The final confrontation came at another family gathering, Uncle Robert's birthday party, 6 months after that first disaster. My parents arrived separately, their marriage apparently another casualty of their business collapse. They looked older, smaller somehow, their confidence replaced by a brittle anxiety that made them seem almost fragile. The family buzzed with whispered conversations about their fall from grace, bankruptcy proceedings, criminal investigations, their perfect facade finally stripped away to reveal the rot beneath. Some relatives offered sympathy, others judgment, but all of them watched with the fascination reserved for spectacular failures. I arrived fashionably late, carrying a wrapped gift and wearing the kind of understated elegance that suggested success without flaunting it. My novel had been climbing the bestseller lists, my advance had grown into substantial royalties, and my second book was generating serious buzz in literary circles. My father cornered me by the punch bowl, his hands shaking slightly as he poured himself a drink. "You won," he said without preamble. "Are you happy now?" I studied his face, searching for the man who'd spent 2 decades undermining my dreams. He looked defeated, broken in a way that should have satisfied me. Instead, I felt only a hollow echo of the rage that had driven me for months. "I didn't win anything, Dad. I just stopped losing. You destroyed us." "No," I said gently. "You destroyed yourselves. I just turned on the lights." He stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "When did you become so cold?" "When you taught me to be." My mother approached as my father walked away, her designer clothes replaced by something off the rack but still elegant. She'd always had good taste, even if her morals were questionable. "I suppose you think we deserved this," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I think you deserved consequences. Whether those consequences were proportional to your actions, that's not really for me to judge." She laughed bitterly. "You sound like a politician, all careful words and implied meanings. I sound like someone who learned how to communicate from experts." We stood in silence, watching the party continue around us. Cousins played in the backyard, aunts shared gossip, uncles argued about sports. Life went on, indifferent to our family drama. "The manuscript," she said finally. "Your novel. We really did just want to hurt you. It wasn't about the money or your success. We were afraid of losing you." I turned to look at her, surprised by the admission. "All your life, you needed us," she continued. "You came to us for advice, for support, for validation. We liked being needed. And when you started talking about your book, about moving to New York, about this whole new life that didn't include us," she shrugged helplessly. "We panicked. So you decided to sabotage me instead of supporting me." "Yes." "And you think fear excuses that?" "No. But I hoped it might explain it." I considered her words, feeling the weight of 20 years of manipulation and control. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to find some way back to a relationship that might be healthier than what we'd had, but I also knew that forgiveness without accountability was just enabling. "Here's what I think," I said finally. "I think you're sorry you got caught, not sorry you did it. I think you're scared of facing the consequences alone, not genuinely remorseful for your choices. And I think you want me to fix this for you, just like you always expected me to need you to fix things for me." Her face crumpled slightly, confirming my suspicions. "But here's the thing, Mom. I don't need you anymore. I haven't needed you for a long time. The difference is that now I know it." I left the party early, driving home through streets that no longer felt like my childhood neighborhood. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, less significant. The power my parents had held over me for so long had evaporated, leaving behind only two broken people who'd confused control with love. My phone buzzed with a text from my editor. "First reviews are in. They love it. We're talking movie rights." I smiled, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine joy. Not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, not the hollow victory of destruction, but simple happiness about something good happening in my life. That night, I deleted the folder on my computer labeled Parent Research. Months of investigation into their business practices, tenant complaints, financial irregularities. I'd found enough ammunition to destroy them 10 times over, but I'd used only what was necessary to protect their victims and expose their crimes. The revenge was complete, but more importantly, it was over. 6 months later, I received a letter from my father. He was working as a handyman, using skills he'd learned years ago before real estate made him rich. My mother had gotten a job at a nonprofit that helped low-income families find affordable housing, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on either of us. They'd divorced, but remained civil. Therapy had helped them understand how their need for control had corrupted their love for me and each other. They were facing their legal troubles with something approaching dignity, making restitution where possible, and accepting responsibility for their actions. The letter was an apology, not for getting caught, but for the decades of manipulation that had led to that moment. It was thoughtful, specific, and didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. It simply acknowledged the harm they'd caused and expressed hope that I could build a life free from their damage. I read it twice, then filed it away. My second novel was launching next month, and my publisher was already asking about a third. I'd found a literary community that valued my work, formed relationships based on mutual respect rather than control, and discovered that success felt better when it wasn't tainted by the need to prove something to people who would never truly see me. The little girl who desperately wanted her parents' approval was gone, replaced by a woman who'd learned that some relationships are too toxic to salvage, no matter how much love might have existed at the start. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's liberation. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's refusing to let them define your worth. And sometimes, when someone smirks and says, "It was just an accident," while destroying something precious to you, the most powerful response isn't immediate retaliation. It's building a life so authentic and successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. I kept the letter, not as a memento of reconciliation, but as a reminder of how far I'd traveled from the girl who once believed that being loved meant being controlled. In the end, that was the real story worth telling, not the tale of how I brought down my parents' empire, but how I finally learned to build my own.